Hi, this is Dr. Kat Vlies from Central New Mexico Community College. This is video I in a series of videos on the digestive system. In this particular video, we're going to focus on the large intestine. Let's take a look at the gross anatomy of the large intestine, where the ileum, of course, the distal portion of our small intestine, meets up with the large intestine, the start of the large intestine. We have kind of a sac-like structure, which we call the cecum. It's at this junction right here between the ileum and the cecum where we find the ileocecal valve. Now, dangling off the large intestine, we have a structure that belongs to the lymphatic system called the appendix, sometimes called vermiform, which literally means in the shape of a worm. It really looks kind of like a worm dangling off the cecum. The cecum is then followed by the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, which becomes kind of S-shaped, and therefore the sigmoid colon. Finally, the rectum, which then becomes the anal canal, and that would be the end then of our digestive tract. So the term colon is not exactly synonymous with the large intestine. Notice that there are different portions of the large intestine referred to as the colon, but the whole large intestine includes additional structures. It's always easy to recognize the large intestine on a cadaver, for instance, because it has these little pouch-looking structures, and we refer to them as haustra. They're present everywhere except as we get to the very distal portion of the large intestine, that is in the rectum, and then the anal canal. We'll see what their function is in just a moment. What creates these little pouches is this thin ribbon of our muscularis externa. So our muscularis externa does not form a full tunic following the whole circle of the wall anymore. It's just reduced to this ribbon. And when the muscle in this ribbon contracts, it creates these pouches. We refer to this ribbon of smooth muscle as the tinea coli, literally meaning the ribbon of the colon. Now, not illustrated here on this particular figure are what is called epiploic appendages. And these are these little pieces of or chunks of fat that kind of dangle off the large intestine in all over the place. And it's not really totally understood what function they have. And finally, we find in the most distal portion, particularly the rectum, rectal valves, and we'll take a closer look at them. We're looking here at the rectum, which arises from the sigmoid colon. So here we have the rectum. And notice that we have kind of these invaginations on either side, and those essentially create what we call the rectal valves. They're these lateral curves that allow for the gas that we develop from the feces that are accumulating. We also see around the anus two types of sphincters that control the anal orifice. We have on the outside muscles that are skeletal muscles, and we have voluntary control over them. On the other hand, there's also a set of internal anal sphincter muscles which we do not have control over, and they're made up of smooth muscle tissue. We're going to find that these muscles, of course, play a very important role during the defecation reflex, which we will study. After the rectum, we get to the anal canal, and there we again see a sudden switch from simple columnar epithelial tissue that lines the stomach, the small intestine, as well as the large intestine, except for the anal canal, where we switch back to stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Why? To prevent friction. The feces have to pass through there, for instance, and the stratified squamous epithelial tissues are going to help protect the anal canal. We also see that mucus is produced in this area, again, somewhat lubricating the feces. And finally, we find veins in the anal canal, and as some of us have probably experienced, they can become inflamed, and we then refer to them as hemorrhoids. It's essentially similar to varicose veins that we have in our legs, for instance. So just like the stomach and the small intestine, the histology of the large intestine is very similar in the sense that the mucosa contains a simple columnar epithelial tissue that is extremely rich in goblet cells. Lots and lots and lots of goblet cells. As a matter of fact, when you look at the picture below, almost every one of those columnar cells kind of look white. Those are all goblet cells. This is so typical for slides of the large intestine. We still have microvilli, despite the fact that the main function of the large intestine is not at all absorption. But there is still some absorption of water. Remember, the small intestine absorbed about 90% of the water. Well, the large intestine absorbs the remaining water. We also see lymphatic nodules being pretty prominent in the submucosa of the large intestine. After all, we're much closer to the other end of the digestive tract that faces the external environment that can lead to the entry of pathogens. So talking about lymph nodules and pathogens, bacteria can enter into our digestive tract from both ends, right? From the mouth or even the anus. Now, these bacteria that enter the mouth and survive the stomach, which is kind of amazing if you think about it, considering how acidic the stomach is, or even survive all of the chemical digestion in the small intestine, they're ultimately going to enter into the cecum. Remember, that's that pouch-like beginning of the large intestine where the ileum meets the large intestine. And there, many of these bacteria are going to participate in digesting those carbohydrates that we didn't succeed in digesting in the small intestine. So they're going to ferment these indigestible carbohydrates, such as cellulose, which we find in the walls of plant cells, for instance. Now, the consequence of the action of this fermentation by these bacteria is that they create gases that can get rather odorous, as we all know, and I give you some components of some of these gases. They do some good things too, these bacteria, aside from fermenting indigestible carbohydrates, and that is they synthesize some very important vitamins. So they synthesize some of our B complex vitamins as well as vitamin K. Now, we need to ingest some of these vitamins too, but notice that we can depend on some of our bacteria to produce these vitamins for us. And recall that we need vitamin K for clotting, and we need vitamin B for dividing of cells. I've already said many times that the large intestine does not have a main function in absorption. That's not to say that it doesn't absorb some of the remaining water, maybe even some vitamins and electrolytes. But really, its most important function is simple. It's the making of feces and moving them towards the anus so that we can excrete them. Very little digestion anymore, except for whatever the digestion of the bacteria go through the fermentation, for instance, of those carbohydrates. So really, we don't totally need the large intestine. Just like the stomach, it is not essential for life. Now, a few words about diarrhea. We've all had our bouts of diarrhea, and this is due to the fact that the food, for some reason, has something in it that the food that reached, or I should say the remnants of the food that reach the large intestine have something in them that is not allowing for the food to stay long enough in the large intestine, to where the large intestine can reabsorb or can absorb, I'm sorry, that 10% of water. And that leads to a very watery stool. If we talk about the motility in the large intestine, once again, we see that segmentation is the most important form of motility. Segmentation was also the most important motility in the small intestine. When it comes to segmentation, the hoster play an important role. Remember, those are those little poofs, those little pouches that form the that we see in the large intestine. And it's in those little pouches that we see contractions occurring, allowing to the mixing of the food. They occur about every half hour, and this is all controlled very locally. What stimulates the hostra to contract is just the arrival of food remnants to where the wall of the large intestine is being stretched. Peristalsis in the large intestine is often referred to as mass movements. They tend to occur 3-4 times a day, usually after we've eaten a meal. And this involves more of our long reflexes. Once again, we're bringing up the gastroileal reflex. We've talked about that before when we discussed peristalsis in the small intestine. It basically says that if the stomach becomes busy, we're going to see that the ileocecal valve will relax and food can enter into the large intestine. We're going to add another reflex, and that is called the gastrocolic reflex, meaning that as the stomach gets busy and the ileum gets busy, that's going to lead to busyness in the colon. It's as simple as that. And these are long reflexes. Let's take a look now at the mechanism of defecation and the defecation reflex. This is a parasympathetic reflex, by the way, that is integrated in the spinal cord. And recall that the parasympathetic fibers arise from the sacral portion of the spinal cord. So it's essentially a sacral spinal reflex. It's going to involve contraction of the rectum muscles and eventually relaxation of those 2 anal sphincter muscles, and ultimately also contraction of the so-called levator ani muscles. And if you translate this, these are muscles around the anus that elevate the anus, and when they do so, the feces are left behind. The whole reflex depends on our Valsalva maneuver that we learned about in the respiratory system, where we close off our glottis with the help of the epiglottis, and then contract some of our abdominal muscles as well as our diaphragm to increase the pressure in our whole abdominal area. To better explain the defecation reflex, I have color-coded the diagram I've included so that you can follow which pathways are afferent pathways, efferent pathways, which ones are parasympathetic versus somatic. So let's get started. So in the green here, these are sensory neurons that arise from the sigmoid colon and the rectum, and they detect stretches as feces are beginning to arrive in this area. And so these sensory neurons send action potentials to the spinal cord, the sacral spinal cord. Integration occurs, and as a result, we're going to see that parasympathetic motor fibers are going to start dumping acetylcholine onto the smooth muscle of both your sigmoid colon and rectum, causing them to contract, squeezing the feces even further into that anal canal. And we also see that some of the parasympathetic fibers are going to start relaxing the smooth muscle that makes up the internal sphincter. Remember, the internal sphincter is made up of smooth muscle, while the external sphincter, anal sphincter, is made up of skeletal muscle and is under control of the somatic nervous system. As feces begin to accumulate more and more in the rectum and the anal canal in particular, pressure starts to build. That pressure is now being sent into the brain. The brain then sends signals into the spinal cord such that with the help of our somatic nervous system, we can now decide whether to relax our external anal sphincter or not. So in the blue, we have somatic motor fibers that release acetylcholine onto the skeletal muscle of the external sphincter to cause it to relax. And of course, that allows us to defecate. But we can make this as a conscious decision. So this is input coming in from the brain, so we can decide, yes, we're going to go and we're going to defecate, or we can decide no. And consequently, we're not going to see any signals coming down these somatic motor fibers. This reflex then stops after a few seconds, and then as a whole new mass movement starts after a few hours, we're going to see that this reflex is reinitiated. And so this wraps up our discussion of the large intestine. So we've now finished discussing all parts of the digestive tract, starting with the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. At the level of the mouth, we've actually already looked at some of the accessory structures, that is the teeth, the tongue, as well as the salivary glands. But we still have some really important accessory structures to discuss, and they include the gallbladder with the liver, as well as the pancreas. So those are some structures we're going to focus on in the next few videos.